So our next presenter is from EcoJustice. EcoJustice is an organization that tries to use the law to enforce the environmental laws that are already on the books. And I spoke to Devin Page once, who's the executive director of EcoJustice, and he says, you know, this is the absolute worst way to affect action on environmental issues because the law takes so long. You know, you're going to have a case and then an appeal and objections and so on and so forth. It's not a very efficient way to do it, but it has to be done. So the work of EcoJustice to hold governments accountable for their own environmental laws that they have on the books is absolutely indispensable. Our speaker is Reid Gomme. He's a young lawyer who was working on the youth climate case. And this was a very challenging case. There was over 20 expert witnesses, and they're representing 7 plaintiffs who, when I first started listing this on the schedule, I called it the kids' climate case. And he said, you know, when we started this, they were kids, but they're not kids anymore. So we have to call it the youth climate change case. I hope we aren't going to be calling it the middle-aged climate change case, but it still needs to be done. And they're basically taking the province of Ontario to court for violating their own climate laws. So please welcome Reid Gomme.
Thank you very much, Glenn. How does that sound to everybody? Sounds good? All right. So as Glenn said, my name is Reid Gomme, and I'm one of the lawyers that has been working on this Mather et al. Case officially when you see it written up by the courts, but we call it the Ontario Target Challenge. And the target we're talking about is the current Ontario government target of only reducing GHG emissions by 30% by 2030 from 2005 levels. So I'll go into the details about why that target is insufficient and why it's the root of why this case occurred, spurred by 7 youth applicants. Before getting into what EcoJustice's involvement is and these youth applicants and how our case came about, I'd also just like to reiterate I'm very appreciative to be a guest here on Anishinaabe Nation territory, specifically the territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, traditional keepers of this land. I am one of the lawyers, about 3 or 4 of us total, through many years of this case that have come and gone and stayed on, working with 7 courageous youth applicants on behalf of themselves, other youth, and future generations as public interest litigants are taking Ontario's government to court for insufficient GHG reduction targets violating their charter rights under Section 7 and 15. So today's presentation will take you through some of the history of how and why this case was brought, the long road traveled by counsel, the applicants, and so many in support of them to get to a hearing just last month in Toronto after the case was launched about 4 years ago now already. And I'd like to highlight why this case is already a milestone in Canadian legal history for putting forward environmental rights under the Charter, even though we don't have a decision on the merits yet. The fact that we got to a case to argue evidence before a judge about climate change and the harms it brings is something to be said in and of itself, where many other cases have had difficulty getting to even that stage. So the commitment and the talent of these young people will be evident, I think, throughout this whole presentation. Do we have the first slide? There's just a piece of art on the first slide I'd like to show to folks in the room. Yes, so this is some beautiful artwork made by one of the applicants, the youngest applicant, Sophia Mather, her name being right on the heading of the case. So she drew this up to promote the case so we could have it at rallies and just get people excited to get out and be involved. But you'll also hear later, she wasn't able to come all the way out to Tobermory, but from the Toronto area, Zoe Curie Matzner, one of the amazing applicants. I've got a video of her part of this story as an applicant pushing this case forward, and we'll play that video of her presentation and hopefully be able to get her to call in and take some questions at the end if we have time, in addition to any questions you might have for me. So let me get this clicker going. There we go. So first, just a little bit about EcoJustice. So as a lawyer, I'm working for EcoJustice, the largest environmental law charity in Canada, representing these 7 youth. But EcoJustice's history is obviously has gone back beyond this case to about 1990, when the first iteration of it was established. And its whole point as an organization is to use the power of law to defend nature, combat the climate crisis, and fight for a healthy environment for all. It's the only environmental law charity in Canada that can take on strategic public interest litigation from coast to coast to coast. And we share our expertise through the lawyers, the scientists, communications experts in the organization to help community organizations, Indigenous groups, and everyday Canadians who are on the front lines of the fight for environmental justice, to be heard by decision makers, to get their voices out, including into a court of law. We've represented clients in consequential cases across Canada, several interveners in the recent Greenhouse Gas Pricing and Pollution Act case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, but as well here in Ontario, other consequential cases such as taking the Ontario government to court for the way it repealed the cap-and-trade system without proper public consultation, which was determined to be unlawful, and also efforts to preserve areas like the Duffins Creek provincially significant wetland from harmful ministerial zoning orders that at least for some time Ecojustice and partners were able to put a halt to, but the battle goes on in that area. As for myself, I became inspired to work with Ecojustice through my time in law school in Ottawa, where I'm currently living and where I went to law school. I took part in the Ecojustice Clinic. It's a way to get folks in law school understanding of the potential to use the power of public interest law to fight for a healthy environment. And right at the time I took that clinic course in 2019, not too long ago actually, this case was just being launched. So I really got to see in real time that what I was learning, what I was trying to get in my head, the understanding of how the law could be used in solidarity with climate activists and those that are pushing for greater environmental protections. And that's really all that convergence at the same time with this case being launched is what led me to pursue working at Ecojustice onwards to today. So before I get into the details specific to our case, I do just want to talk a little bit about why this case was even necessary. It's unfortunate that it was necessary, and there are several crises that have converged to bring about two opportunities to tackle those crises. The two crises are the climate crisis, as we know it, and climate change, and the related political crisis that has been the abject failure of governments around the world to address that climate crisis. Pictured here are youth and other activists gathered in Glasgow at COP26 last year, one of many moments, dramatic moments of efforts to use activism and awareness to push governments to act in the way we need to have a livable world in the future. But to date, this has not really slowed down the issue. But not all is in crisis. Through activism like this and other opportunities in courts of law, we're trying to solve the crisis, both the climate crisis in and of itself, but also the political inaction to solve it. So this first opportunity presented by youth and climate activists is the effort to see the survival of the planet through their lifetimes and beyond. The perspective that youth bring growing up today is to see that climate change is not just a threat of an idea of targets and moving forward, but to the very life they'll have to live in those years when we talk about the target for 2030, 2040, 2050, and even 2100 for the youngest people today. This is their actual lifetime. So they are providing that energy that we need. But it needs to be harnessed in the law to make the ultimate changes we want to see. And many youth understand this and are working with groups like us to see if they can force human rights instruments to be harnessed to solve the issues that they're so worried about. So in Canada, and in this case in particular, as you'll see, we're talking about trying to harness the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in a way to protect environmental sustainability. The ultimate question at the heart of our case, as I'll explain, is can these youth, the 7 of them together on behalf of all youth in Ontario, harness the Charter to hold the Ontario government to account for failing to prevent and actively contributing to the climate change harms that they're seeing and are poised to continue to see through their lives. There are hopeful indications that the answer to that question can be yes, both in Canada and around the world, but before getting to that hope, I do have to walk through a little more detail on the crises at hand that brought about this case. So I am not a scientist, just a lawyer representing scientific issues in courts, but I do want to just go a little bit into the issues that were highlighted in our case and in other cases like it. So of course, in these 4 images, you might recognize some of the issues that we're dealing with as a result of climate change. We know that for species beyond humans, of course, in the natural world, climate change is an existential threat, threatening mass extinction. For example, in the Arctic, we're poised to see in the next tens, in the next decades, polar bears without ice that they need to sustain their livelihoods in many Arctic regions. But climate change is not just taking away territory for certain species like polar bears, it's also actively contributing to expansions and harmful results of those expansions for other species and how they can harm humans, for example. Mosquitoes, as you can see on this photo, and ticks, as we put forward as evidence in our very case, are expanding their regions into Ontario where they were never seen before. New types of these species bringing diseases like West Nile virus or Lyme disease. So that convergence of changes to natural world and human interactions, and as we've seen with this pandemic as well, which we could see things like that accelerate moving forward, it is a real concern. And of course, then crossing over into specific human concerns as well. You can see on the two pictures on the right, you might notice where that first picture up top right might be if that big metal structure didn't give it away. That was in 2019, so heat waves experienced in Europe, pushing temperatures through to absolute record levels of 43 degrees in Paris and causing about 2,500 excess deaths through that summer alone in France. And then actually at the bottom right, that's my hometown in Salmon Arm, British Columbia. I took that photo last summer in 2021. And as you may recall, there were temperatures pushing 50 degrees in the interior of BC, sparking catastrophic wildfires, which we've seen many summers. But this summer specifically, I remember we really couldn't be outside for more than about a half hour without being absolutely lightheaded. We were making use of our COVID masks more outside than in. And at the end of the dock here, you can't see the beautiful mountains in behind the lake, but this is Shuswap Lake on Secwepemc territory. And there's a sign that says, smoke-free property. I think it's pretty ironic. It's much, much harder to enforce that law, not from people smoking, but just the air that's breathed right in that region all through the summer. So these are some of the impacts already happening, but some, even the most severe, can be prevented still with fervent efforts. And as you are likely aware, translating the science behind all these concerns, as the science can be very complex, but we need it to be communicated to everyday folks. A lot of work has been done through groups like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, through their reports to try and help people understand exactly the crisis we're facing. These reports make clear that when we're talking about preventing the worst impacts of climate change, we should be concentrating on limiting warming to certain degrees. For example, there are significant differences in what our world would look like after 1.5 degrees of warming, 2 degrees, 2.5 and 3. Every incremental amount can result in catastrophic differences and results for the humans that live here. For example, a special report in 2018 on 1.5 degrees set out that limiting global warming to 1.5 versus 2 degrees could reduce the number of people both exposed to climate-related risk and susceptible to poverty by several hundred million by just 2050. And so that was in 2018. And there are newer reports since then, but I thought it pertinent to keep this in because just this last week, that dream of 1.5 degrees was reported by the UN to potentially be all but gone. So in 4 years, we're talking about hundreds of million people essentially condemned to totally different living conditions by 2050. So this conference was supposed to be held in 2019. The way we can talk about this is how we've shifted so much since then. There are tipping points as well, not just gradual changes like that, that could be triggered depending on if you are at 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees or above. For example, the difference of multi-meter sea level rise from melting ice sheets depends on that difference of 1.5 to 2 degrees over the next many decades. You could also have 99% loss of all coral reefs if we go up to 2 degrees as compared to trying to keep it close to 1.5. So just to emphasize how these incremental changes are so important, and realizing that we're actually on track for closer to 3 degrees worldwide puts into perspective the challenge ahead. So by 2030, it's clear that the world must reduce its emissions by almost half, is what the IPCC report said in 2018 and maintains now, to stay anywhere close to that 1.5 degree level, which is getting increasingly more difficult to stay around. So the 2020s are evidently a very crucial decade in the fight against climate change, and a big reason why these cases like ours have to be brought now. That government inaction on climate change that we're seeing in these reports should be self-evident is the second crisis. it's a crisis that we have climate change, but it could be responded to, so the non-response is a crisis in and of itself. Despite knowing about climate change since at least the 1980s in significant detail, governments have failed to take action that has really changed course. For example, in 1998, we had a conference hosted in Toronto on changing atmosphere and implications for global security, and the conclusions then sounded very the same as they do now. It was well understood at the at the conference in its conclusions that climate change would be a major threat to international security, and we were already seeing harmful consequences around the globe. The target then that was set out for the world was reduce emissions by 20% below 1988 levels by 2005. But as you can see in this chart here, that dream since that time really has never been realized. In fact, GHG emissions have only ever seen a constant increase since that conference, for example. So this political failure, of course, has been in many parts of the world, but Canada in and of itself exemplifies a track record that is nothing too exciting to talk about. Canada has made many commitments to reduce GHGs, both at federal and provincial levels, but since 1998, with commitments made in 1992 at Rio, 1997 at Kyoto, 2009 at Copenhagen, and 2015 through the first iteration of Paris targets. I don't have to take you through all the numbers. All you can see is that the goals are far lower than the realities of where we've gone, and that gap has only really widened. So there has not been an improvement or a trajectory we can say is positive. So what to do about these crises? The crisis of the effects that we know are happening and the inability to tackle them. Youth really are leading the way in so many respects around the world. Youth are bringing their voices to the streets and to courts now as well. It was youth that responded to that 2018 IPCC report and forced the issue to the forefront with massive rallies in Canada and around the world of tens of thousands often, taking to the streets, which compelled, for example, many climate emergencies at least to be declared by municipalities, provincial and national governments, and worldwide. But action more than that, of course, is needed. Youth are perhaps the most effective spokespeople for this movement because when they're speaking, it's from a first-person perspective of what they know will be the impact on their life, nothing theoretical. It is real. It will be experienced. So these images are from some of these rallies in 2019. You have Alena Rougeau, who led Toronto's Fridays for Future movement for some time there, and other examples on the right side from climate strikers in Washington, D.C. around the same time, and from San Francisco on the bottom left. Now, the youth are leading this activism, but they've made clear, and our applicants made clear, it can't just be taking place on the street, it has to take place in courtrooms. So they want their messages translated into legal change to secure their livable future. And that brings us to this second opportunity to harness the power of human rights instruments to protect these youth from harmful decisions made on climate change. Specifically in Canada, we're looking at using Charter of Rights and Freedoms and what it could deliver under Section 7 with the freedom of the rights to life, liberty, and security of the person, or under Section 15.1, equality rights, specifically looking at how every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection of the law without discrimination, and in particular, in our case, without discrimination based on their age and how the laws might affect their age throughout their lifetimes compared to people of older ages. So, what can the proper role of courts be in combating climate change? Is there a way that courts can step in where political action has not been, or are there also times when, of course, political action simply must occur and the court's proper role is not to dictate exactly what's going to happen in policy, for example? This is a very difficult question to answer in a constitutional democracy. In a constitutional democracy such as Canada, though, it is often somewhat of a blurred line. We've seen how courts, using the Charter to protect fundamental freedoms and democracy over the last 35 years, have ensured that where governments have failed to protect our most important rights, they've stepped in on women's right to choose, on the use of things like medicinal cannabis or access to rights to medically assisted dying. These are often policy-integrated decisions. It's not a clear line where courts cannot act to force governments to respond to not enough initiative on charter rights. But traditionally, and for the most part as we've seen so far, charter rights have not really expanded into environmental protections. For the most part, cases brought forward in the past have not pushed that needle, but the hope is that when you face an existential question, a truly existential question like climate change, with catastrophic, clear understandings of the evidence of what is actually going to occur because of it, that the Charter can finally push into the environmental sphere. Can the state consciously and intentionally engage in conduct that can alter the basic ecological conditions necessary to enjoy life on this planet and indeed have a charter and a country and a world at all? That's the kind of question that we're posing. Now, it sounds like a dream. Many scoffed at the idea of using the courts to defend against state-driven climate change harms up until someone did it and succeeded. So for example, in 2015, this picture of a group of citizens and lawyers in the Netherlands, well, they did something miraculous. They took their government to court under the equivalent of constitutional protections in that jurisdiction over their government's failure to act on climate change. And eventually they won. So in that case, citizens claimed the Netherlands' commitment to reduce GHGs by only 17% by 2020 compared to the 2005 levels was insufficient based on IPCC science that said that reduction must be at least 25% to put ourselves on track for warming that is at least livable of close to 1.5 or well under 2 degrees. And essentially the courts accepted that evidence as being consequential enough that it ordered the government to come up with a new plan to get to those levels of a livable future. And that case has been affirmed by all levels of court in the Netherlands, and so it stands as the law in that country today. But the Netherlands has a different legal system. It's not inherent that Canadian courts are going to accept this lead. So work has to be done by groups like EcoJustice to answer the question of how this success can be replicated in Canada in support of youth activists who are fighting for the same outcome here. And that brings us to the story of our case, finally. So the things that had to happen were certain political actions by the latest Ontario government, well, before this last election, I guess, the first iteration of a Doug Ford government, and decisions that were made in 2015 or 2018 to reduce the climate targets, and the 7 youth who responded to that reduction in GHG reduction targets to take the Ontario government to court. So I'm going to talk a bit about exactly how this case started and these youth that are behind it and where it's going in the future. In brief, our case targets the Ontario government's actions and inactions in perpetuating climate change, but specifically looking at one decision to reduce the ambition in Ontario's reduction on GHG emissions. So before the Ford government was elected in 2018, Ontario was one of the few governments in Canada with a fairly decent record of setting targets and acting on climate change, for example, through efforts of reducing coal-fired electricity plants that were reduced and phased out. The Climate Change Mitigation and Low Carbon Economy Act that had been set by the previous government set out targets for 2020, 2030, and 2050, progressively increasing in ambition, and included a 2030 target of 37% below 1990 levels. So from the new target based on 2005 levels of emissions, that would be about 45% by 2030, which is almost in line of what the IPCC says needs to be done to stay around the Paris Agreement consensus on 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming. But when the Ford government was elected, it passed this Cap and Trade Cancellation Act, and that got rid of all pre-existing targets, and it replaced them with just one insufficient target, about 15% lower in ambition compared to 2005 levels at 30% reduction by 2030. Our theory for this case essentially said that creates a weaker target to lock Ontario's function, its economy, the expectations of everyone operating in Ontario, to allow for a dangerously higher level of emissions that will accelerate the climate crisis. So Ontario will be backtracking on ambition at a critical period where improvement is imperative. When the government took this action, many of these 7 youth were already very involved in speaking out on climate change. They had already attended rallies and spoke out against what they saw all around the world as an attack on their future and their right to survive. But they were spurred specifically on by this action in Ontario, where they live and where they expect to live their lives in the future. So on EcoJustice's end, we saw in these conversations with them a challenge of this targets decision as an opportunity to finally set a precedent in Canadian law where we could secure rights under the Charter for a safe and stable climate moving forward. So we started conversations with youth, such as these 7, and they got together and decided to file a case in November of 2019 on this issue. So our case ultimately seeks to strike down the current inadequate targets and have the court order that new targets based on real evidence of what climate change reductions need to be for a safe and livable future can entail. So basically targets in line with IPCC science. We brought evidence setting out all the different ways that Ontarians are said to be impacted by the government's backsliding. Heat waves, infectious diseases, fires, as I already explained in my first few slides, we are already seeing the impacts of in Canada, as well as floods, unhealthy water qualities, and mental health risks, just to name a few. Effectively, Ontario's targets will violate our clients' right to life, security of the person, due to the cumulative impacts that insufficient GHG cuts will fuel. But we're also alleging that the law is discriminatory in the sense that climate change will have disproportionate impacts on these youth, many of whom currently cannot even vote to have the say on the leaders that are making these decisions right now for the impacts on their future. What more, these 7 youth, as I explained earlier, are bringing this case on behalf not just of the 7 themselves, but as public interest litigants representing youth and future generations across Ontario set to face these harms and discriminatory impacts. So, to get into exactly who these youth are, I'd like to introduce you to Alex, Beezy, Maddie, Shaylin, Shelby, Sophia, and Zoe. And this is the first time any of these youth have been involved in a court case, but it's not their first fight. As I've explained, they've all been involved for years in environmental, climate, and Indigenous rights activism. So for just some examples of the leadership, I'd like to explain a little bit of Shelby's background. Shelby is an Anishinaabe and Cree woman. She was 23 when this all started in 2019. She's an artist and community support worker focused on Indigenous food sovereignty and security in Northern Ontario communities like her own. And Sophia was only 12, the youngest of the applicants when this case launched. And she was the first student in Canada to join the Fridays for Future movement, starting striking for climate in her hometown of Sudbury in 2018. Now, for a bit more context, specifically from the youth themselves, Zoe Curie-Matzner, one of the amazing applicants, has recorded a video. She wasn't able to come in herself or necessarily connect on Zoom. We weren't sure how that would work, so we recorded a video to just have a message from her to share her perspective as an applicant with you all today. So if we can get that going.
Hello everybody, I hope you're all doing well. My name is Zoe, I use she, her pronouns, and I am a climate activist from Toronto. I am a member of the local chapter of Fridays for Future, which organizes climate strikes, and I am also a plaintiff in this lawsuit against IPOR. So when I started this climate lawsuit, I was only 12 years old, and I just started going to the Fridays for Future climate strikes that began in Toronto in December 2018. So in that same year, the UN climate scientists, the IPCC, had just issued their report stating that globally we have to cut emissions in half by 2030. We were told that if we didn't, we wouldn't have a chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and this is still true. 1.5 degrees is the very limit we have if we want to prevent irreversible climate catastrophe. Here's a metaphor. So, all our world, and all Earth's ecosystems, and all our societies, everything is standing on the edge of a plank. We're edging closer and closer and closer to the tipping point, or the numerous tipping points, where the plank begins to tilt, and then we all fall. But we aren't there yet, and that is the crucial thing. When the first strike in Toronto happened in December 2018, we had 12 years to go before reaching that 2030 deadline. The strike was extremely small, just a bunch of kids, parents, and a few others. And it felt a bit silly, to be honest, but I think that made it all the more important. This tiny group of people knew the seriousness of the crisis, while everyone else around us was carrying on as normal. This is a thing I kind of feel often, like going to high school in the middle of a climate crisis. We know what's happening, but our lives and our systems haven't really changed, even though we know our climate systems are breaking down, and our governments and institutions are continuing to cause their breakdown. So, when Eco-Justice reached out in early 2018 with the news that they were preparing a lawsuit against the Ontario government for backtracking on climate action, it was clear to me that this case was extremely important. So, there are 6 other plaintiffs in this lawsuit, and they are all, like, the most incredible activists from all across the province and just the coolest people, so I do suggest you check them out. And since this case was launched in early 2019, I've watched as the climate crisis has worsened all around the world. So my mother is from Australia, and in late 2019, the fires there were absolutely devastating. My family and friends there couldn't leave their homes because of the smoke, which led to hundreds of deaths, thousands of hospitalizations, and the fires and the smoke led to 3 billion animals, I believe, being killed or harmed. And here in Canada, we've seen the horrific heat dome in BC, in which 600 people died. The massive wildfires that obliterated towns, and the wildfires in Ontario in 2021. And now it's 2022, and we've just experienced one of our hottest years on record. If we had 12 years to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half back in 2018, now we have 8, almost 7. And now we're already at 1.1 degrees of warming. We've lost 2/3 of Earth's wildlife populations in the last 50 years, and we're seeing devastating impacts, such as the recent hurricanes in Southern America, and the flooding of Pakistan, which displaced 33 million people and killed nearly 1,500, many of them children. It is important to understand that the most seriously impacted by the climate crisis are those least responsible for causing it. Climate change is a social justice issue, as it makes every problem in our society worse. Yet, over these past few years, despite the warnings from the UN, despite hundreds of thousands of deaths due to climate change, we've kept moving closer and closer to the edge of that plank, or the tipping point of that plank. But we can still see the way out, and we know exactly how to get there. The way out will require a massive effort. Experts say we need to transition off of fossil fuels, invest in renewable energy, and mobilize to address the climate crisis in the same way that Canada invested and mobilized the country for the Second World War. We need to support fossil fuel workers and communities impacted, at the same time as taxing the oil companies who've made millions when gas prices and temperatures rise. And this time, by confronting climate change, we can tackle so many other problems in our society too, because transitioning off of fossil fuels will require not only investing in renewable energy, but also investing in public transit, bike infrastructure, urban farming, insulating our homes, expanding green spaces, stopping urban sprawl, green jobs training, and support for Indigenous communities, as well as actually respecting Indigenous land sovereignty. And we need to do all of this and act like our lives are at risk, because they are. I remember at the start of this lawsuit, we were asked to write a statement about what it meant for us. Like a why statement, in a way. And I remember mine was rather nerdy, as, if you can't tell, I am a science nerd. And it went something like, oh my goodness, this is the only planet that we know of with life in the entire universe. Why are we still destroying it? Why are we still causing so many people to die? One of the things that really upsets me still is a lack of education or understanding about the crisis at such a late stage. In fact, according to a recent report, half of Canadians don't know that CO2 from burning fossil fuels causes climate change, and half of us can't pass a climate literacy test. As well, most people believe that Canada is a leader when it comes to climate action, when in fact we're one of the worst in the G7 economies. And most of this comes from a report, which I can link to, I guess, later. But I also did a bit of research in my own class about climate education. So some things that I found were that people were really good at linking climate change to natural disasters such as floods or fires, but they couldn't link climate change to human impacts such as famines or conflict. And as well, lots of the terms that climate organizers use, such as just transitioning off of fossil fuels, greenwashing, and IPCC, most people don't understand. The thing about a lack of climate understanding is that it is not our fault if we do not understand the climate crisis. This is because those who are responsible for this crisis are also those who are responsible for the lack of education around it, the fossil fuel industry. It is infuriating to me that the oil and gas industry has known since the early 70s that the burning of their product would cause global warming. But instead of addressing this, they decided to double down on profits and spend literally millions of dollars on public relations, spreading misinformation and paying people to promote climate denial. And it's also infuriating that when this denial stopped being so effective, they shifted the blame onto individuals. So, in fact, some of you may know, but it was the oil company British Petroleum who came up with the term carbon footprint through an advertising campaign. So when faced with a hurricane, what do? Recycle. When faced with wildfires, what do? Turn off the lights more. Telling people that climate change is about individual actions and that it's their fault leads to a ton of anxiety and makes people feel incredibly powerless. Now, I'm not saying that individual actions aren't important, but each of us turning off the lights more is not going to get us to that target of cutting our greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. Instead of turning off the lights, we need to change our electricity system so having the lights on doesn't generate carbon emissions. That's why one of the easiest, most impactful things people can do is just to talk. Educate other people about the climate crisis and just talk to others. This creates a huge ripple effects that actually creates lasting change. And changes can happen. I remember that in the late summer of 2019, I believe, you could feel the awareness of climate change shifting. In September, after 9 months, that tiny group of parents and middle schoolers had grown to literally tens of thousands of people marching in the streets. Soon after that big strike, Toronto declared a climate emergency, and the movement has not stopped since then. Just recently, the lawsuit against Doug Ford had its hearing, and the decision on our case will come sometime in the next few months, and if we win, it will be a historic victory and could actually force our government to act. All of the plaintiffs in this case are young. Doug Ford's government has rather more money and power than we do, but I think this shows that each of us has so much power to address this crisis, and it just means getting together through collective action, and it means taking a stand. And there are literally so many ways that everybody can take action on the climate crisis. If most of us are uneducated about this crisis, imagine what we could all do if we were educated. I think that if we were all educated about climate change, we'd all be climate activists. There are as many ways to take action on the climate crisis as there are people. If you're an artist, make art. If you're a writer, write. If you're a premier of the most populous province in Canada, strengthen your emission reductions targets. We can all take action, even if our government refuses to. We understand that this is the critical decade for action. Everything we do in the next 8 years will affect me, my fellow applicants on this lawsuit, and our generation forever. We know that by cutting back on that 2030 target, Doug Ford has failed us, and failed our generation. But we have not failed. We are here today, and we are loud, and we are angry. And when it comes to climate change, we know that there's so much that we could lose, but there's also so much that we can save. Everything we do in the next 8 years matters, including everything we do to help. We have a world to save, so let's get to work. Thank you!
Excellent. Do we have back to the... You've got her on the phone? Okay. I've got a few more things to say, and then we'll go to some questions with Zoe, and if you have any for me as well. If we go back to the slideshow, I just want to explain a little bit where exactly we are with the case before going into questions on it and for her. All right. So just to give a little bit of context, Zoe and other youth are not only in the 7 of them bringing this case, but many other cases are being brought around the world and even in Canada. But what's happened so far is that it's very difficult to get a foot into the door in the courts with the issues of like climate change. There are many other cases like the La Rose case, challenging federal actions in perpetuating climate change, or the case of Enjeu, Environnement Jeunesse in Quebec, which is a class action brought on behalf of all 35 and under citizens of Quebec for the impacts government decisions at the federal level, again, are having on their future. But these cases had very broad sort of iterations of what the problem is. All impacts from all policies being brought by the federal government, for example. And courts so far have determined at early motion stage that that kind of issue wasn't justiciable. The court was not the proper place to be taking on such a broad question. But in our case, we were able to get to a merits hearing, even though Ontario did bring a motion to strike the case for similar issues, saying it shouldn't be in court. It was not answerable by a judge. You cannot resolve this issue. But we challenged one specific decision, which was the change to the target from about 45% from 2005 by 2030 to 30%. And a court, at least at that lower level, determined on the motion to strike that our applicants had a chance to prove that the charter harms that they were alleging were occurring and that a court could make a decision to resolve that matter. So this is really the first milestone of this sort where a court said that this is a proper question to be putting to the Ontario Superior Court at the very least, and why we ended up with a hearing this last month in Toronto. So that was way back in November 2020. So then the work really started where the court said, you're allowed to bring evidence of climate change and talk about the harms under the charter that will happen to these youth. And so we got 17 different experts across climate science and climate economics to put forward exactly the impacts that will occur in Ontario to these youth and to all living through this province's future, and how those harms are set to worsen, specifically as temperatures rise, and Ontario's specific contribution to the level of harm that we'll see, which, while it is small in the grand scheme of the world, is not de minimis. It is not irrelevant that Ontario is part of the problem, and actually disproportionately part of the problem compared to the world average. So those affidavits entered into evidence the opinions of the experts themselves, but also expert opinions from governments, from the Environmental Commissioner's Office when it existed in Ontario. Really excellent evidence in there, as well as IPCC reports themselves on the record. So many thousands of pages of evidence, and the judge has quite a task to look through, but that's the nature of scientific evidence that has to go in on this case. In response, Ontario really only submitted reports from two purported experts whose unfortunate written testimony at times verged on climate denialism, and argued that Ontario's contributions were irrelevant in the span of the world, which, as I explained, other courts across the world have found is not an excuse. For example, the Netherlands has about the same amount of emissions as Ontario as a jurisdiction, and a court had no problem there finding that their contribution was a relevant harm on a legal test to the youth in that country. So through the spring and summer this year, we worked with colleagues at Stockwoods LLP to have cross-examinations on all of this evidence, which, as you can imagine, with over 20 experts, takes quite a long time. But really, the evidence put in on our end stood. Much of it wasn't even challenged by Ontario, so the evidence on climate science, they admitted, of course, is true. And finally, we drafted our written submissions, setting out those arguments of both of the facts of climate change and the legal arguments under the Charter. Ontario had a chance to, of course, write back on their submissions, and we had a reply, finally getting all that done over the summer to a hearing in September. But our applicants were not alone when they got to court in their fight. We had 6 interveners from amazing organizations providing other perspectives on top of those brought by the applicants. Notably, for example, Indigenous Climate Action and the Assembly of First Nations highlighted particular impacts of climate change on Indigenous youth in the province of Ontario. And Friends of the Earth highlighted many instances of similar lawsuits worldwide, and an argument that Canada has unwritten principles of ecological sustainability that must not be compromised by government decisions. We can't say that these interveners specifically were intervening on behalf of the applicants. That's not the point of interventions, but we can say that their evidence contributed greatly to supporting the case that we were making, and really no evidence went to help Ontario. So Ontario stood alone in their arguments. Now, I do have another video, but I think since we have Zoe on the phone, I'd like to get to some questions and answers if anybody has any. Okay. I know that we have lunch coming up soon, but we do have a very exciting video just of the environment that we were able to capture at just before the hearing in Toronto. The hearing was virtual, but we were able to gather at Queen's Park with the applicants and many supporters just to express how exciting this moment was to finally get to a hearing. So it's only about a minute long, if you'd like to play that video, just so you can see how much the work went to create this, this exciting time.
When it comes to climate change, we know that there's so much that we could lose, but there's also so much that we can save. Let's get to work. Thank you.
As an Anishinaabe, I have hope. You know, I need to have hope to fight for a better future for all of us, for everything that is living and being on this earth, and this planet, on this land.
It is clear that Indigenous laws and values, which are aligned with the natural laws of Mother Earth, have so much to offer the world now in its time of need.
The youth are just incredibly inspiring to work with. I'm just blown away at how brave they are and how eloquent they are at a young age. And so I just feel really privileged to be representing them on an issue that's so important, which is essentially their right to a livable future.
What do we want? When do we want it?
So just setting up that right after that we had the hearing, and we're awaiting the decision. It could take many months considering the over 20,000 pages of evidence that were filed in this case, but we're hopeful that the result will see the evidence we put forward as validating the climate harms and the infractions that are alleged by these 7 youth. So I think if we still have Zoe on the phone, we can take any questions folks might have for her specifically as a youth climate applicant, or for me as well on the eco-justice side of things. Is she still on the phone? Okay. Hey Zoe, can you hear us?
I can, yes.
Okay. Awesome. So we've got the room of folks here, and I'll just see if anybody has any questions for Zoe on her experience, or for me on the legal side of this case. Feel free to ask. It's okay if folks don't have any right now, but oh, we've got one in the back. So I was not personally working on that case, but I know that work is ongoing on that challenge from my colleagues in Toronto. I'm at the Ottawa office, so we work on separate cases for the moment. But I believe there was an update last week, so it's ongoing. But I can't speak to exactly how it's resolved, but it's not over. Yeah.
Just wondering how Zoe felt about the September court case, the time in court, and feeling positive. Any particular observations that she has on it?
Did you hear the question, Zoe? Yeah.
Yeah. It was really cool. I mean, it was really busy, and of course, being in a virtual court is a bit different from being there in person. But it was really awesome to just have it be the moment after so many years of work building up to that point. And I think it went really well, to be honest. I understand that I might be a bit biased in that respect, but I think it was really powerful.
That, you know, we couldn't have the youth sit, say, right in front of the judge and to see in person Ontario's council face to face, but we were able to have the court allow the youth to come on Zoom and have their faces up at the beginning and to be introduced by Nader Hassan from Stockwoods LLP working with us. So that ability to have that visibility for Justice for Met specifically, of these youth, 15 to 26 years old, was very important to them, and we're happy that the court allowed that to happen.
I'd just like to say thank you, Zoe, and it is inspiring, I think probably for all of us here in the audience, to hear the efforts that you have made on climate action, and I think we all thank you.
Thank you for everyone who's there doing everything they're doing.
Sorry, Zoe. That wasn't a question as much as just absolute admiration for all that you're doing. So yes, thank you so much. Do we have time for one more question? Okay.
Hi Zoe, my name's Monica. I work as a land use planner in Bruce County. I really admire what you're doing, and I think this legal case is a great idea because you're going after the big prize. So my question to you is, if this case is not successful, what will you do next? And if this case is successful, what will you do next?
Yeah, this case is not successful. I still think that it is, no matter the decision, it's already made a big impact. And part of the impact is making climate change and making climate change an issue, like in the media, and having more people be aware of it and how the government's actions influence the crisis. And if this case is successful, it could really be like a historic precedent that could actually force our government to do something and then have ripple effects across Canada. And no matter what the outcome, I'll keep doing climate action and working with everyone I've met in this process and keep fighting.
All right, thanks so much, Zoe. We're at the end of the presentation, but thanks for calling in, and we shared your video. I really loved it. So, thank you. Yeah. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Thanks so much, Reid and Zoe. Pass on our deep thanks to Zoe. I mean, what are you going to do if the case doesn't win? I'm reminded of Mr. Bumble in Charles Dickens. If the case doesn't win, then the law is an ass. But your job is to make sure that they aren't by coming down with the right decision, recognizing that there's huge risk on whether or not this is a long shot. And this is not the only way to affect change. There's other ways to affect change than the law. But it's something that had to be done, and we greatly appreciate you working on that. I'm on the board of Eco Justice, and we had an annual general meeting not so long ago. And it's a pretty big board, like 16 people, and it was all a virtual meeting and all that. And I'm not sure how many lawyers Eco Justice has now, but it's quite a few. And Reid's name came up as one of their rising stars. So I said I was pretty sure we got the right person, and I think we did. So thank you, Reid. Thank you, Zoe.
Thanks so much for having me. I didn't want to go too far overtime, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, no.